Welcome to our discussion about the documentary film The Red Orchestra, the anti-Nazi resistance group in Berlin between 1933 and 1943. Many artists were in the group, and we will speak about Rainer Küchenmeister, who was one of the youngest in the group. You can still watch or re-watch the film until tomorrow, January 30th. There will be time for Q&A after the conversation, so please put your questions in the chat. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art, based in New York. This is an event in our series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. I'm honored to introduce artist and filmmaker Stefan Roloff, who works in Berlin and New York. In 1984, he was invited to experiment on prototypes of digital video and imaging computers at the New York Institute of Technology, where he produced videos with Peter Gabriel and suicide. He received a 1989 fellowship from the New York Foundation for the Arts for his pioneering digital work, which has been shown worldwide in museums and galleries. In 1997, he began work on his second documentary film, The Red Orchestra, a portrait of his late father, Helmut Roloff, a resistance fighter against the Nazis, which was nominated Best Foreign Film 2005 by the Women Critics Circle. For some years, the subject of resistance remained a driving force in Stefan Roloff's work. He created video portraits of 80 dissidents from former communist East Germany, resulting in a series of installations. Among other works, he's currently working on a project about the smashing of monuments and a graphic novel-style feature about the Red Orchestra. Welcome, Stefan.
Hello.
How did you come upon the Red Orchestra, Stefan?
I think it was by accident. I had kind of known that my father was part of the resistance, but being that he was part also of the silent generation, which is something that anybody who knows Germany post-war or even in the decades after, would know that people, it doesn't matter if they were perpetrators or resistors or victims, if you want to call them that. It's not a very nice word, I always feel. That all of these people had one thing in common. They were all silent about what happened. So when I was, I think, when my father, I lived in New York and I went to Berlin once a year. That's how it happened. And at one point, I saw that my father was growing old. It's just something when you have that time in between, you have like a year in between each visit, you see how people change, you see how they age. And at one point, I realized that death was at some point going to come. Not that I realized that at that moment, but it was that moment where I saw it wasn't going to be a very long time anymore. So at that point, I wanted to paint my father because foremost, I am a painter. And I got a canvas, I got some brushes, and I went to Berlin. And then I realized, no, I have to ask him about something. And that goes back to when I was 12 years old. My father once, at that moment, invited me to go with him to the north of Berlin where I'd never been. And it was odd. And he didn't say anything about it either. And then we went to this gathering of people who were putting down a wreath and they were talking about things relating to Hitler's time. And to me, my 12-year-old mind, it wasn't very interesting, I have to admit, because I was part of a new generation, a new life that had grown after the war, and all this past was present, but it was present like a dark cloud that hung over us. And I didn't want to have anything to do with it. So I never asked my father any questions about it. Of course, in the decades after, I did find out through the grapevine mostly that he had been a prisoner of the Gestapo and he had been a person who had been resisting that regime. And so at that moment, when I had wanted to portray him before his death, I suddenly realized I have to do something else. I have to interview him. I have to start a conversation with him. And it was very good because he was so old that the silence that I mentioned before was not important anymore to him. He was too old for it. He had passed beyond that point of not being able to or not wanting to deal with it. And I think he also was happy that I was asking him for a conversation. And so we spent a long time filming these conversations. And the last thing I have to say about it is, of course, I never knew whether he had betrayed people. Why did he survive? Because most of these people were executed. And so that was a little bit of a worry that I had, but it was something I had to do. I had to find out who he was, who he had been, and that's how my work with the Red Orchestra started.
Mm-hmm. So, how did interviewing your father impact your relationship and your life, your personal life?
Okay, my relationship with my father was never bad. Even in all my most craziest and most rebellious times, I always had the feeling that he understood me and he was behind me. And he even if he didn't say much, it was obvious and apparent that he was somebody who understood me somewhere. So I didn't need a good relation with him, but I think, and I saw that afterwards too. I know so many people whose parents died, and they all say, "Oh no, I should have talked to them. I should have used that last moment." And so it seriously impacted my life in that it gave me a lot of peace knowing that I could talk with him. And it was kind of like you take a friend and you bring them to the train and they take off or the plane or whatever. And you say goodbye to them and you wish them farewell. And that was that moment. It was privately and personally, it was very important for me to have that inner peace for myself, that I never had the feeling I missed out on asking him about it.
Mm-hmm.
How did it affect my work?
Mm-hmm.
Um, well, up until that moment, my life had been very much the life of a painter. Even though I'd made films, I'd made documentaries too, I'd always branched out. But basically, what I was doing was working in my studio, and it was more like a life that was not intellectual, let's put it that way, for lack of a better word. It was a very intuitive life and it was a very driven life by intuition. Yeah. And so suddenly I had to study things that I had refused to study throughout my life, basically. For example, when I decided that I would do this documentary project, I realized that I knew almost nothing about it. And so I contacted the Resistance Memorial Foundation in Berlin, and the director invited me. And he said to me that I was embarking on something very important because at that point, nobody had really analyzed this. There was a lot of work to be done. And that's what he told me. And then he gave me a giant pile of books, all historical books, which was kind of, there was a slight element of shock, let's put it this way, with me that I knew that I had to read all these books suddenly. And not only that, as I read them and I started reading them and I read them, I realized that I had to analyze, contextualize, I had to do a lot of things. And that, of course, led to this, which I've dealt with in my work since then. It's a very narrow path. as a painter, you're kind of outside of the narrative. And as a person who is making documentaries or working on something like that, you are in the narrative. And so they're kind of enemy territories or defined as such. And to me, it was very important. It's very important until today to deny that gap and to kind of make a fusion out of the two of them. And that's what that led to in my work.
Mm-hmm. Why was the group called the Red Orchestra?
So when in 1942, a lot of men and women of all ages and social background were arrested by the Gestapo, the greatest shock that the Gestapo had and that Hitler had when he found out about this was that these people were seriously the gamut of society. I mean, they were in Berlin, they were Berliners, but they were the gamut of society. Um, there were cleaning personnel, there were aristocrats, there were carpenters or artists, there were everybody basically who you could think about, people who worked in administration, it didn't matter. Everybody was in there. The oldest person arrested was 86,
Mm-hmm.
83, I'm sorry. The youngest was 16. That was Rainer Küchenmeister, who we will talk about later also. And 40% were women, which is unique in the history of German resistance. Most of them were always men of a certain age and social stature.
Mm-hmm.
So it comes as no surprise that the Gestapo was seriously shocked by that, by realizing that Hitler had enemies in every facet of society. And it was unfathomable to them because they basically, fascists, of course, what defines them is the need to order things and put them all into little squares and create enemies between these little squares. So to find out that in the case of this group, they could not do that and they would have to deal with such a large variety, they decided that they would define them and put them into a very simple definition box, which was called espionage. And the best thing was communist espionage. So they called them the Red Orchestra. Uh, it's important to understand that also due to the large variety of these people, that most of them never knew each other. Most of them would have never met each other because they had such different paths in their life. But you have to imagine this concept of 6 degrees of separation. If you have one friend and you trust this friend enough to invite them, which was the way that it worked back then, because if you talk to the wrong person, you would be beheaded. You would be beheaded for listening to the wrong radio station and so forth, and forget about resistance and things like that. So when these people were all kind of meeting through that, most of them did not know each other. But the Gestapo didn't care about that. They needed to create this image. So they said, a spy who sits on a Morse machine and types in Morse codes is a pianist. A group of pianists is an orchestra. And if they're communists, they're red. And thus came the name, the Red Orchestra, which we've had a discussion. I've had one with myself, but I've also had one with the historians of the Resistance Memorial Foundation. The question was always, do we use this name, which is the Gestapo given name? And the consensus really was yes, because it's best to use the enemy's language against them. That means you take this word that they created to say something bad, but you take it and you own it and you make something positive out of it. So that's where the name comes from, and that's why it's been used by me and by others as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So is it known how large the group was?
Yes and no. The Gestapo in the end of 1942 arrested approximately 120 people. They had to arrest them. They were observing them. They'd been observing them, and at one point they realized that one of these people was working in the counter-espionage uh, offices of the German government. And so they realized if this guy gets wind of that we're observing these people, he'll tell the others. So they made arrests a little earlier than they would have normally done, and arrested 120 people. So we know that the group is larger, but how large is very difficult to tell. I have discovered personally one person who survived. I have met another person who survived. And my father told me about a third person who did not survive because they were killed in a bomb raid, but he said that that person totally partook in the activities. So we have, in my case, 3 people that were never arrested, never found, never arrested, never photographed by the Gestapo. And history they always need a definition, of course, historians do. And so they have kind of taken the mugshots that the Gestapo took, which are approximately 120, and they have defined the so-called Red Orchestra through these mugshots that the Gestapo took after the arrests. Where still you have to realize there were, I think, 2 people in these mugshots that had nothing to do with the group. They were accidentally arrested, but they were photographed nevertheless, and then they were released. So there are at least 2 people in that whole series of very interesting photographs, which I believe those of you who saw the documentary, you saw it in the end, when the credits roll, you saw morphings of some of them. So people, it's a complicated definition of the group based on these photographs, which were also, by the way, abused after the war by secret services and others. But it was a definition, and it's a group. It's 120. So let's say if there were double that amount or 3 times that amount even, it would be like 300, which would still be a very small percentage of a city with what, 2 million inhabitants? I don't know how many inhabitants Berlin had at the time, but certainly more than 300. You can kind of count on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Much, much too few, that's for sure.
Yes.
Yeah. So how Barbara is asking, can you talk about how you decided on the black and white sequences you used throughout the film? Why that particular format? Also, was all the historical film footage really historical, or were there any reenactments?
Okay, so I decided on black and white because I feel black and white means something. It's a contrasty, it depicts a moment of contrast. People are either for it or they're against it. Society is polarized.
Mm.
It's 2 polar opposites, and the best way for me to depict that was through black and white. As you can see, I rarely sometimes also went into sepia, and the reason for that was because in sepia I felt I could isolate black and white faces that I wanted to say something about. These faces that live in a sepia world, symbolizing a very old world that we know from old photographs, but the the experiences of those people, in particular, were those of people in a polarized world, and polarized worlds are dangerous because there's always one power in them, and that can really make it very bad for people in the other. Now, reenactments. Yes, that's a very important question because the reenactments to me, okay, so when I started interviewing and I realized that beyond talking to my father, this was growing into a much larger sub project, and I started meeting these people that were old friends of my dad or relatives of people who had been murdered or survivors and other people. But all of these people were very old, and so they would talk with long pauses in between, and they would tell these amazing stories about illegal activities and everything that needed to be known. But if I had just filmed their faces, I would have had to do jump cuts. And a jump cut is basically like, let's say I have my hand up here and I'm saying this, and suddenly it's gone and my head jerks. So I could not work with jump cuts. I could not edit these people into a cohesive sequence. So I needed images to superimpose. And it took me honestly a year to think about it and to come up with a solution. Um, it was not going to be reenactments, definitely not, because what could be more kitschy than filming actors reenacting something that a person with a lot of feeling and experience is telling and talking while communicating a traumatic situation? You cannot. So I then decided, yes, I will do some things. I'd animated my paintings in the past into movies. And so I thought that I could, based on that experience, I could create something that would, in this case, have real people in it, not pure paintings, but people, and that you could see when you see this in the film that it's not real. It's not pretending to show the situation, but it is illustrating it in a way that you can imagine it can take you there together with the words. And in that way, I came up with the idea of which was, by the way, the first time in documentary that something like that was done, um, just to avoid reenactments. I
Mhm.
hope that answers the question.
Yeah, very much so. And one of our listeners is also saying black and white does have the ability to transport people to another era. I quite appreciated the effectiveness of the black and white choice in the documentary. So
Thank you.
confirming really what you wanted to express or where you wanted to bring the viewer.
Mhm.
Did um, did you get an education as a filmmaker, or how did you approach this
Um, no.
project? And what were the challenges of the whole project?
Okay, so when I was in the art school in West Berlin in the 1970s, I they that's when video started, and video became kind of a tool that artists could begin using. It was at that point that artists realized there's another. At that point, back then, there was still a lot of discussion: is photography an art? Because people said no. And some other people said, of course it is, because you will always have a selection. There's something subjective about it.
Mm.
You don't see the whole room in a photograph and so forth. So anyway, within all these discussions, video started to encroach into the discipline. And so to me, it was always very important to explore new media and new possibilities. And so, of course, immediately when I heard about this, I signed up for the video class. And I made a couple of videos back then. And then when I moved to New York in 1981, I got the chance to work with very high level production facilities. Some of them were what Rachel, what you mentioned before,
Mhm.
were the early digital art, but I also was able to produce films. And then but they were all very experimental and they were all based on either digital or a painting. But then I branched out and I made short films.
Mhm.
And then at one point, and that would take way too long, it would take us way out of this uh, subject here. I came upon a prison suicide in West Virginia, and I made my first documentary film about it. It was just also one of these situations where you discover something and you know you cannot look away from it. It doesn't matter, even if it's might be threatening to you and so forth. You got to do it. So that's how my first documentary film then happened. So there was not the normal go to film school and graduate type background, but there was many elements of studying, but mostly elements of doing it. And
Mhm.
that's how I came upon it.
Yeah, thank you. And what was the discovery that touched you most during your research and your interviews for the film?
I think what touched me most was the fragility of these people that I met, the gentleness. They were not, like tough as resistors as you would think, we're gonna like move this typewriter secretly and they all look like Dick Tracy and things with hats and trench coats. Not like that. It was more like these gentle beings that they were, who where you meet somebody and they're very gentle, you could think that they could be uh, scared easily or something, but it's not that way. That's a very generalization type thought. And no, to me, that was, I believe, I've never had this question before, and so it was not a prepared answer I just gave you, but it came to me when you asked me.
Mhm.
That's what that was. That's definitely what it was. Yes.
Yeah. So I think we should move on to Rainer Küchenmeister because we
Mhm.
picked him as an artist who was portrayed in your film. But you will be able to tell us a little bit about him, a little bit more. And I will
Mhm.
provide the images if I just.
So maybe we should say something before, though, prior to showing the images, I think is
Right.
important. Um, as those of you who have seen the documentary know, is Rainer Küchenmeister met this woman, Cato Bontjes van Beek, in prison. The reason was that so many women were arrested that the Gestapo was taken by surprise and they had to empty a whole tier in the prison where they put the women. And the women were on a higher tier and the men below. And she was in the cell above Rainer that you saw in the film. And they started communicating. And of course, Rainer fell in love with her. He was 16. A boy, hears this voice of this woman. And, but she's 22 and she's more has a motherly relation with him. And she also has a boyfriend. And beyond that, she's supposed to be executed, and she will be executed. So when she finally she received her death sentence and she communicated it to Rainer, and he wanted to raise hell and beat up the guards and everything. She told him it was very important for him to survive. And she told him, "You have to tell our story someday. You have to live. And please seek the beauty of life in art." And this is something important because Rainer really came from a working class district. He grew up in a tough neighborhood. He was a tough guy, but he was also a teenager. And so she she introduced him to literature and art in prison that he only dealt with it, he told me that, because he was in love with her. Had he not been in love with her, he wouldn't have read any Goethe or Hölderlin or whatever she sent his way. He would have thrown it out. And because he had no interest in that. But because this was this woman above that he loved, he had to read this stuff and he had to communicate with her about it. And then when she told him, "You got to survive," and she said, "And you must promise me that you become a painter." And he said he would. And he told her that what he would paint would be the way that he felt her, because he only knew her voice. He never got to see her face. And so after the war, and now we can go into the series of these images, he did hold his word. He became a painter. He became quite a successful painter too. He was in documenta a few times, which for those of you who know what documenta is, it's probably the most important international art show in the world. And he was shown it twice. But what he painted was always people without faces, without heads, or with severed heads, as you can see in this one. It resembles a figure, and this one, I'm not going to interpret it. I think when we look at it, we can all see what is on here.
So how did they communicate? I mean, they were both in prison
Yeah.
cells. How did they, how did they transfer like the literature, or like how, how did that work?
Cato was very crafty. Rainer always said that. He said there was this one prisoner who had a toothache. And of course, there was no real dental service or anything like that. And so so Cato got a lemon for this guy to put in his mouth, which is amazing if you think about it. How do you get a lemon in a German prison of the Gestapo, of the worst kind, in 1943? You cannot. But she did. She knew how to do that stuff. And so she also had a piece of string. And with that piece of string, she could send down little notes that they could write to each other. She could pull them up when he had written something to her. And those secret messages you have seen in the documentary, where Rainer's daughter actually reads Cato's letters to him, and he reads the ones that he read. And the other part of the communication was, of course, verbal, but that was whispering through the windows so that he would hear her voice. And that's why the only things that he knew about her was her voice and her handwriting.
Mm.
And of course, the fact that she loved art and the literature that she shared with him. But as you can see, all these images, and this is very interesting, uh, there's never a a face in them or something, but you always have the sense of a human body with something that is invisible or impenetrable. And he he had a very interesting interpretation for that as an artist, because as an artist, he was never going to share his trauma or the origin of what made him do this with the public or other people. So his official version was always that faces lie. You can paint a face, but the face lies. There's other thoughts behind it. There are other ideas that are invisible. And so he always said, I don't paint faces because faces lie. But in fact, he painted these beings without heads, also communicating. And what is also very interesting about Rainer is that when he reached a certain point with that work, he stopped. He did not continue painting. It was not, despite the fact that he was a successful painter with patrons and other artists that were famous supporting him and so forth, he never became one of these artists that produced for a market. He'd had something to say that was profound to him. And when he had said it all, he did not start producing. He finished, he stopped. And that's why I feel when we look at the work of Rainer Küchenmeister, we look at the most real art that we could look at. It's it's not painted for a market. It's not a gimmick. It's something that is crucial to him. It's the message that he had to give to the world, and he did it.
Mhm. And do you think he didn't care whether people got the whether people understood why he did what he did, or
I think Rainer was a very smart person, and he knew, I mean, everybody knows that you could tell people a story, but most of them will not understand it, or they will understand it in their own way. Everybody's going to take a different thing home. So, being that he was not a person of words, why would he start telling people? I mean, he gave me an interview in the film, which was the first interview that he had ever given and the only one to anybody talking about this. And he explained it to me why he did it. For one, because we met at the house of Cato Bontius van Beek, of her family, the woman who was decapitated. And her brother had told him about me. And second of all, he said it was because I was an artist and a painter like himself. So he trusted me with that. And the third was we just liked each other. It was just instant. We had chemistry. So it was those three elements that made him talk about it with me, but he wouldn't talk to anybody else about it. And that actually is interesting because I had that experience with others in the group as well, such as, for example, Karin Reetz, who is in the film, who's the daughter of a man who was decapitated, and she was arrested as a young child, as a teenager, and interrogated, just like Rainer, same age. And so she also told me, and after I had interviewed her, which was very tough to even get her to talk to me. It was a long process. But once she did, she never gave another interview to anybody. And I know a lot of people contacted her, as she told me, because they saw the film and they wanted also to do an interview, and she refused. So I think it is, again, it touches on that, what we talked about in the beginning, the silence, the need for silence, the need to deal with the unspeakable. What better way is there to express it but art? And I think that's what Rainer's path was. And naturally, he would only talk to somebody who had also chosen that path, kind of. I know I sound eloquent, but I'm not necessarily a person of words.
Mm-hmm. So David was asking what was unique about Rainer and Cato that led them to join the Nazi resistance?
Cato was older, so she joined because she needed to. She saw injustice, and I feel this is very important as a knowledge about courage and a stance that people can take. Most of the people in the Red Orchestra were not Jewish, and they were not persecuted. They were also, many of them were not communists, so they were also not persecuted. They could have led a regular life. They could have pretended, hey, you know, everything's fine, or I'm going to wait it out, or all these things, but they did not, because they could not stand looking and witnessing injustices, people being picked up. You know, in the case of Cato and my father, they had a lot of Jewish friends and Jewish contacts. It always depended on which facet of society you came from, who you knew or who you didn't know. But they were more artists, intellectuals, so obviously they knew Jews, and they saw how they were treated, how they had to go into hiding, all these realizations that came. And they could have easily said, this is too big for me, or I got a job, or I got children, or I got whatever, which many people did. And so the Red Orchestra to me is also important as an image because of the variety, and it means there's no excuse. You can resist
Mm-hmm.
no matter what. So Cato, it was the simple fact that she could not stand seeing what was going on. Rainer came from somewhere else. His father was a communist. And so as a communist, he was, of course, against the Nazis. And Rainer was his child. And one of the central figures, the Red Orchestra did have a couple of central figures in it who were not major, or I mean, they were not leaders, as has often been interpreted by people who did not understand the nature of something like that, but that think similar to the way that Nazis would think about it. But they were central people, meaning people who knew more than just five within the group. They might have known 10 or 15 people. And one of these guys recognized the power of the father of Rainer Küchenmeister as somebody who was working class, but had a brilliant mind, was able to write texts that would also speak to people within the working class. And because the Red Orchestra was doing a lot of leafleting, they needed people of all sorts and of all backgrounds that they could write for certain groups to understand the language. So that's how Rainer's father became involved, and Rainer just happened to be alone. That was the problem. He was with his dad, and his dad took him along, and he took him to these meetings, and you know, and so he and obviously Rainer hated being that he was an unruly teenager, why would he like those people, the Nazis? I mean, there was no way. And so to Rainer, it was more through his dad, but also through the fact that he was a teenager who had been raised in a part of society where people just said, we're not going to deal with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So someone is asking, do you carry, for lack of a more accurate word, some of the burden that Rainer carried and shared privately with you?
Yes, it's a very strange thing. I mean, I've even done projects with children of dissidents because naturally in every family, things are inherited, and part of the things that are inherited is, of course, trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So in my case, naturally, like I said, I was living in New York. I was having a very different life, one that had nothing to do with this. And I wasn't thinking about it, and I was never even considering it to become part of my life. But inevitably, it caught up with me. So, and I saw that with all these, or not all, because I also have brothers, and they don't have that relation to it. But and I saw it usually is one kid out of a group of siblings that for some reason that is inexplicable gets hit by this, and they have to do it. You could say, oh, okay, it doesn't interest me. I mean, you could do that,
Mm-hmm.
but if you don't, then obviously that's something you have no choice. You have no
Yeah.
choice.
Yeah. So Allah is asking, how did Rainer survive?
Okay, Rainer survived. He has directly credited his survival to Cato, the woman in the cell above him, because when she said to him, "You have to survive to tell our story," that was kind of a job she gave him.
Mm-hmm.
Again, being in love with her, he decided that he would do what she asked him. He became an artist and he survived. Those were two tasks that she gave him. And witnessing in prison how she would do a thing like that with a lemon that I described before, that she would get a lemon for somebody who was suffering because they had a terrible toothache and other things. She would sing songs out of the window of her cell about freedom and so forth. He realized, and what she did with himself, he realized that she helped people. And he says that in the film, that's what got him through the camp later, because he was then put into a concentration camp. And throughout all this, the mud, the dirt, the loss of anything you might own, whatever circumstance you live under in a camp, he somehow managed to keep her letters, those little papers where she had written those notes, and transport them all the way through until the end with him. And he said, the moment that he got into the camp, he took somebody else that he could help because he said this is the only way not only to keep your dignity, but also to survive is if you help somebody else. And that's how he survived.
Mm-hmm. So how did those letters survive?
Well, he had a belt somehow that inside of that belt he was able to hide these letters, and that's how they survived. And Cato's, the ones that he wrote to Cato, this is very funny. I mean, it's kind of absurd that back then people. I mean, first of all, my father as a student, he he studied in a different city than where his parents lived, and he would send his laundry home to be washed by his mother and returned to him in another package. This is ridiculous in today's time and day and age, but that's the way people did things. And the Gestapo expected for the prisoners to send their clothes home to their families, for them to wash them and to return them to prison. So Cato would open seams in a dress or something, and she would put these letters in there, and somehow through a code language that people are very fast at developing code languages when they communicate with their families. Under circumstances like that, she said, make sure you find this stuff. And so that's how they found it, and that's how that survived.
Amazing. Was it dangerous for him to keep those letters?
Of course,
Very
if
sus.
you had, if you found things like that talk of freedom, he couldn't have been worse off than being in a camp. I mean, that was the worst situation he was under, so it wouldn't have threatened his life at that point or anything like that. He might have gotten some punishment, but then they got punishment all the time. But the greatest danger to him would have been that those letters would be lost because somebody would find them, they'd throw them out. They'd destroy them right in front of him, tear them up and throw them out. So that would have been the danger that Rainer would see. Cato, similar situation. Had they found them, they would have said, oh, okay, but she was already a death candidate. So what else could they do? So it wasn't the same like when you're outside, what I described before, and you decide not to look away. At this point, you're kind of in the fangs of the system, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Right. So why wasn't Rainer killed?
Because he was 16, he was not he was able to somehow during the interrogation say he had nothing to do with this. He didn't know anything about it, and that's how he survived.
Wow.
All these people were interrogated, and all of them had to kind of make up things as they went along. And there's a little segment about that in the film where he talks about it, as well as Karin Reitz, the other woman that I talked about before, whose father was executed and who was arrested and kept. And both of them were suddenly had these policemen aggressively asking them questions, and they had to answer them. And the best answer you can give is, I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Were any members of the orchestra recognized as righteous Gentiles by Yad Vashem in Jerusalem?
Probably, but I'm not sure. I would be pretty sure about that, but I'm not sure who and if and how many.
Yeah.
Because I think the thing with Yad Vashem is you have to have hidden Jews. I think that's the prerequisite for that. I'm not sure, but I think that's what it is. So you need people who you hid, and many of these people were not in a situation that they could hide people. They were doing other actions that were even more dangerous. But so it could be that because of that, many would not be, and the other would be, then those Jews would have had to have survived to tell the story. And thus there was no.
Yeah.
But
I think,
but some of them probably are.
yeah. I think you had to endanger your life to save other lives. I don't
Well,
think it's, yeah,
that
not,
would kind of go for all of them then, but
yeah.
there's always a lot of politics involved, so you never know.
They have a very strict definition, and maybe, I mean, that's something we should try to find out, like that somebody is included and so on. Yes.
I mean, the other thing that is very complex about this is still, when the Gestapo defined the Red Orchestra as a communist spy network, that entered history writing.
Mhm.
And as you know, I have a good friend, Ellen Myers, with whom, and prior to that, her husband, who died, but we spent about 20 years getting the Red Orchestra recognized and part of the permanent exhibition of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And that was a big feat also because it involved breaking through these prefabricated opinions about it. But
Mhm.
finally, we did it, and we managed, and we wouldn't have stopped until we did it anyway. But it took 20 years. So
Mhm.
sometimes you have to go through a lot of red tape until it's finally and ultimately recognized.
So, so they are integrated. The Red Orchestra is now integrated in the permanent exhibition.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's it's actually what they have is a display of letters that my grandfather and my father wrote to each other, like what I talked about before. You invent some sort of a coded language.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also, there's a letter from a lawyer who explains to my grandfather that his son had done something really bad and, he's going to get his punishment. So, I mean, for a lawyer to write that who's supposed to defend you, kind of also. So those things together with the photo, I think, of my dad, that's
Mm-hmm.
what's in that exhibition, representative for the group of the Red Orchestra.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, when you talk about possibly 130 people were arrested and killed, if I understood correctly, Allah is asking, and there were possibly 300 people in the Red Orchestra, which is a um, very small part of Berlin population. Did you mean that there were more people, you think? Were there only Berliners?
Well, so I found, which Rachel, you and I have talked about this, that would be the subject of a whole other event. But I did find a Jewish woman who had survived the Red Orchestra, the time, because she managed to hide her identity from the Nazis and she survived. And she hid people. And she was the first one who told me about this, or the only one who told me about this, which is today historians have recognized it. The Red Orchestra had a system of hiding people,
Mhm.
which was similar to the Underground Railroad, which meant you spent a day here or a couple of nights there and then you moved on. And so she told me at one point she had to take somebody outside of Berlin to the countryside and deliver this person who had been escaped from a camp or something. It was like somebody who was really very visible. Also, she described this as that she was happy when she was rid of this person because that he was too dangerous. But some farmers took him outside of Berlin. So that whole thing, who and where, and would you consider them part of this? Of course they are, obviously. It's impossible to tell in retrospect because these people are dead. I started doing this when my father was very old, like I said, so when was this? I started this thing in the late 90s, the mid to late 90s. And that means that was already 50 years or what, 40 years or 50 years after the end of the war, and most of these people were dead. And so it's impossible.
Yeah.
All I know is that everybody I spoke with mentioned others that they knew, or that they knew that friends of theirs knew further people, but they didn't know who they were. So the number that I said, 300, was a guess, a wild guess, and nothing else. It could be many more, it could be many less. The fact of the matter is, we know 120 people were arrested and photographed, and I personally knew of three more people that were never arrested.
How did you find the photographs?
Oh, the photographs were in the Resistance Memorial Foundation. The originals are in the military archives in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, because the Nazis the Gestapo who took these pictures, the reason why they kept them, because they destroyed a lot of evidence of what they had done, and they burned most of their papers and archives and everything. But the reason why they kept this one was because they always had the plan that they would survive their own interrogations and imprisonments by the Allied forces or the Russians or the victors of the war, by telling them, well, to the Russians they couldn't have, but to the Allies in the West, they could tell that they had been hunting communists. So they needed all these photographs to back this up. And that's how these photographs came into the hands of the victors of the war, and they ended up in the military archives in Prague.
Yeah. So Susan is saying, it's unclear to me, even after seeing the film, how the group was discovered, how the Nazis found out about the group.
It is in the film, but it's a brief thing, and I will reiterate it. So the group had, if you want to define what their goal was, it was kind of a truth of information campaign, because the press was lying. They were like talking about things that Hitler wanted to see or the Nazis wanted to communicate. Nobody ever talked about the arrests of these people because Hitler had said silence about all that. So they had three ways of communicating. One was pasting stickers in the street secretly, which you saw in the film. Another was sending leaflets to other people that could be either Nazis, high-ranking Nazis, or they could be people, professors or others who might have a network of people that they could distribute these further. And the third were two foreign embassies. One was the Americans, which they knew through Mildred Harnack, who was the only American being killed in the resistance, consciously staying in Germany. And the other was the Soviets. And so after the war, and they were in the process of getting in touch with Swiss and British consulates also, because they felt the most important and the best way to topple Hitler was by communicating secrets of war, secrets of the economy. And they had a high-ranking military officer in the group, and they also had a high-ranking economics administrative person in the Ministry of Economics. So when they had their contact with the Americans, but the Americans left Berlin in 1941 when they entered the war themselves, and they kind of forgot about this. It was not important to them. The Soviets, when Hitler attacked Russia, they decided that they would need to maintain contact with this group. So they gave them a radio transmitter, which is how the Gestapo fabricated that spy story. Problem was the radio transmitter never worked, which is funny. I mean, they gave it to them, but it didn't work. So at the time, somebody in Moscow they had real spies in France and in Belgium. And they sent a Morse code back in 1940 or whenever the war between Russia and when Hitler attacked Russia. They sent a Morse code to Paris or Brussels, and they said, please go and visit these three people. And they had the addresses and the names, and find out why the radio transmitters are not working. So they went to Berlin, and but it was kind of too late. The arrests were already going on, and they were warned, don't come here again, and so forth. But the Morse codes were intercepted by the Nazis. And that's one thing that people didn't know at that point, was that the Nazis had developed a technology with which they could catch Morse codes being sent and find the origins of where they were being sent to, and or like not the origins, like where they came from, but where they were sent to.
Mhm.
And so they could arrest a group of people in Brussels, and they tortured them for a year, and until one of them gave them how they could decipher these Morse codes. And that's how they found out who these people were, and that's when they started their observations of their homes and of their movement and so forth.
Yeah.
I hope that answers the
Oh, yeah.
question.
Yeah, thank you. So, going back to your father, Jan said, how fortunate that you broke that barrier and asked. I deeply regret that I never did. My father was a Ritchie boy. He never used the past tense for anything. Nothing of his past, childhood, Great Depression, war, nothing was ever spoken of. And knowing the pain behind the silence kept me silent as well. A deep regret, gratitude for what you undertook and for recording these lives and this history. So,
Thank you. I can say one thing to you about that. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't lived abroad for decades. At the time that I started talking with my dad, I was already 25 years living in New York. So I had a great distance to him and to life. And I wouldn't have been able to do, this is what I'm trying to say. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had stayed at home.
mhm,
Um, and also, if you look at such situations where people find out something about the history or the past of a person, it's usually the grandchildren. It's not really ever the children. It's very rare. In my case, it was very rare. And it's really only credited to the fact, I believe, that I lived abroad. If I didn't live abroad, I wouldn't have been, I wouldn't have been able to do it.
mhm. Yeah.
I hope that gives you peace, because it's not like yeah, you can say, I wish I had, but maybe you couldn't. And maybe that's
Mhm.
why you didn't. It's not because you didn't do it. It's because you couldn't.
Yeah. Um, how was your father treated right after the war? And basically the whole resistance movement, I guess.
Yeah, well, they weren't treated well at all. Um, my father was, because as I just told you, the Gestapo and also the people from the Imperial Court of Justice, or whatever that thing was called, they were caught by the Allies, and then they told them this communist story. So the Americans and British bought that, and they felt that these former Gestapo and other people could help them find dangerous communists that would be dangerous for the world order or the new world order. And I mean, it was the Cold War, right? So, or the beginning of the Cold War. So my father that's one thing. He was how do you call that? He was observed and surveilled by the German Secret Service, which worked with the American and the British Secret Service, and which was built by Reinhard Gehlen, who was a former Nazi. So, I mean, obviously these people had a lot of, and they realized there are a couple of people that survived, and it was a mistake that they survived. So they really tried to make their lives difficult. They were also slandered in the press. But the most personal thing that my father told me when I had these conversations is not in the film because it didn't would have opened another can of worms, but he had an agent. Being that he was a pianist, he had an agent. And one day the agent said, and my father liked to play Mendelssohn. And it's not because Mendelssohn was a Jew, he just liked to play Mendelssohn, simply. So the agent said to him, you know what? Soon we're going to be in power again, and you don't need to play that stuff anymore. And so my father said, excuse me, he said, I really don't understand why you're saying this, and I'm playing this because this is great music, and I will play this always and under any circumstances. Upon which the guy pretended to be palpitating, and he, like he couldn't breathe, and he went to the window and he opened the window to get fresh air, and then he turned around and he said, I'm not representing you anymore, and I will do anything I can to destroy your career from here on. And so those were the situations you could encounter uh, in that post-Nazi world where a lot of people were still around that were part of this and active. They had a lot of stuff to hide and they had a lot of stuff to fight for on their own agenda.
Was that different in West Germany from East Germany?
Yes. East Germany, this is a big problem that East Germany has. East Germany, because it's interesting what that led to. So East Germany defined itself as the anti-fascist state because they were communists, they were run by communists, and the SED, which is the East German Communist Party, was the first party in all of Germany, of all the German political parties, that allowed former members of the Nazi Party, if they swore off what they had done before, to become part of this, and they became communists. And the problem with that is that East Germany never recognized their own complicity in the Holocaust, for example. And there are numerous very touching and strong stories of Jews who were communists who had lived in London or wherever they had survived the war. And they returned and they lived in East Germany. And they lived in this system where the Holocaust, the atrocities against the Jews were not really dealt with because everybody could say, I'm part of this communist country. I was never a fascist. I've never killed a Jew, and I've never helped others to do so. So it was difficult. And in East Germany, the Red Orchestra was honored very, very highly because they said these people helped us to fight, helped the Russians also to be protected from the Nazis by communicating with the Russians, which was all big baloney, but that's the way history writing was in the East. In the East, they were the great friends and communists, and as such brothers and friends. And in the West, they were also communists and as such enemies. And both of that was planted by the Gestapo, and it was just like, it's ludicrous. It's ironic, and it's funny if it weren't so sad, but it's kind of funny also that people are so gullible to that you could influence with a simplicity like that. You could influence history writing, and you could influence the mindset of two groups, two polar opposite groups within the same country in such extreme opposite ways.
Yeah. So Diane is asking, this is one of the two last questions. Diane is asking, have you become curious about other resistance groups? My cousin, Hans Friedman, was part of the RED resistance group in Cologne. My family is unpeeling the history of Hans' role in the group. He escaped to England in 1938. So,
Yeah, of course. I did not directly study this, but I've come across it, and I've also come across the fact that naturally there are ramifications, much as, again, with the system of 6 degrees of separation, and it could be much less in this case than 6. People knew each other. The Red Orchestra had family relations with the 20th of July or with the White Rose, and so forth. And so I have studied that, but the saddest thing that I came across during this analysis was when we were working on getting the Red Orchestra into the Holocaust Memorial in DC, and I asked the people there why the Herbert Baum group was not part of it. And for those of you who haven't heard about Herbert Baum, it was the only Jewish resistance group of major proportions, also in Berlin, all Jews, who were all killed for their resistance activities, which were pretty radical. They set fire on a propaganda exhibit and so forth. They were really like doing very dangerous things, and they got caught and they all were killed. And I said, why aren't they in the Holocaust Memorial? And the answer was nervously, because they were communists. So this complex weirdness, let's hope in 100 years or 200 years, if archives haven't been destroyed, that people could put this into the real context, what it actually means. But I feel the studies of, because of that, I feel the studies of these resistance movements is very important. And if you, then the best place to really get in touch with, if you're looking for information, is the Resistance Memorial Foundation in Berlin. You can find them on the internet. And they really are the top scholars about in the direction of all this.
Yeah, and I will send the link in our follow-up email. So somebody is asking, please repeat the name of the Jewish group.
Herbert Baum, B-A-U-M.
Okay, thank you.
And I mean, they probably didn't have a name either, but they seemed to have like a central figure whose name was Herbert Baum, and he was, and so the group is defined as that.
Yeah, thank you. So the last question, Donna is asking, how much exposure has this film received and how can we help share it? Sadly, very relevant to current events in the US. It gave me hope that we can also resist. Separately, has your painting been impacted by this project?
Probably the first question, the last question I'll answer first. Probably it has, though, like what I said before, it's intuitive. My painting is intuitive, so I think I react to things that go on in my life, but also in the world, without becoming political. But I do realize that right now my work is very much dealing with such subjects, not in a literal way. There's a different way. So yeah, so that's how my work was affected. And I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Wait, close that down already. How your film was received and
Oh, yeah.
how we can help
Okay, so my film,
this
I
person.
will only say two things or three because that was the most kind of significant to me was one time I showed it in East Germany, and there was a group of former Stasi people of the secret police of Germany, and they're used to intimidating people. And they really tried to intimidate me during the Q&A, and I enjoyed it because I don't mind confrontation. So I was much younger and they all had white hair. And so I said to them, I said, you guys look kind of young, which was kind of an insult for me, saying that to these people of obviously more mature age than myself. And I said, so you look kind of young. I said, so clearly you were not alive during that time, or at best you were little kids. How would you know anything about it? And at one point they left the movie theater and everybody laughed and people clapped because they knew who this had been and what the intent had been. But there were a couple of things aggressive. Even in the States, also, I once had like sort of a provocateur who probably came from some governmental whatever. But the most interesting thing in New York I had when I showed the film in the movie theater, and there was a and it was downtown. It was at Anthology Film Archives, and it was obvious that a Jewish intellectual high quota would be among the movie audience. So it was kind of a given that people would talk about the Holocaust, but they did not because it was 2004 and Bush had just invaded Iraq. And the, the question on people's minds was, how do we deal ourselves when our own country wages an unrightful war on another country? And that at that moment I understood how timeless, unfortunately, this subject is.
Mhm.
And so it has always led to intense realizations, and currently I'm busy with a project that is still connected to this subject because when we tried to get the Red Orchestra incorporated into the Holocaust Memorial, we had to show my documentary at many places of Jewish life, synagogues, cultural centers, private screening rooms, and so forth. And among the people who saw the documentary, there were always people who said, I'm a survivor, or my parents were survivors, or I am a scholar of the Holocaust. How come we have never heard about this story? And then and it was in all these different Q&As, and they always said, you have to show this to more people. You have to find a way. And they said, you should make a more commercial feature film about it. And this is something that I'm working on since then to realize that because I feel it's very important to tell this story to the largest audience possible. There's so much in it.
Yeah, yeah, very true. So how can we help you? So I can offer anybody who sends an email to me with the address to with an idea where to show the film, I will forward that to you. So there we have a small small solution,
Mhm. Yeah.
and maybe a larger one develops from there. So
Mhm.
thank you so very much, Stefan. The film can still be seen until tomorrow night. So if you want to revisit the film or see it for the first time, please do so. And thank you again. And everyone stay well and yeah, and be well. Thank you.
You.
Thanks.